बंद करो, ठंडा रही है। Hi, good morning everyone, and thanks for joining this session today. We're going to be looking at starting learning outcome 3 with regards to the unit management of class dynamics. So that's the unit, as you can recall, we are studying, and we have covered learning outcome 1 and 2 for this unit so far. Which was done last week, and today we are going to be starting learning outcome 3. So what you see on your screen is the unit specification, just very briefly in terms of what we're going to be covering. So learning outcome 3 would look at understanding how to manage learning in groups to comply with requirements. So the reason why this learning outcome is important is because when you look at a classroom-based environment, when you look at essentially, learners studying with us in a group, the reason of why it says in a group is because when you imagine a classroom, when you imagine a setting wherein you have a number of students, children, learners studying with you in the class, then in those cases, it is generally called learning in group. When we see nurseries, for example, or children in primary school, you would generally see that teachers would put them into some sort of grouping, and that grouping could be done on the basis of their abilities, on the basis of their interest, and on the basis of their, for example, grouping amongst in terms of behavior or attitude. And that is done primarily to look at dynamics of how children would essentially learn or pick up skills or trade from each other. So that is why management of learning in a group is to understand how do we look at putting learners in the appropriate group, and how do we support those learners in the group to be able to essentially achieve or learn, or in terms of develop skills which are required when we are involved in the process of teaching and learning. Now, this particular learning outcome has 4 assessment criteria. So we're looking at understanding what kind of support that we need to provide, or how do we set up the classroom in a way when we do activities or when we do groupings to ensure that the learning is going to be inclusive, and we're going to promote equality and diversity and ensure that every learner in the class has the equal opportunity to be able to, I would say, learn and essentially, progress in the class. The second one we are going to be looking at is how to minimize risk in terms of safety, health and safety, security, and provide in general an environment in which the learners feel safe and they are motivated to learn. So this particular assessment criteria will focus on understanding the settings that we need to create, things that we need to implement, policies that we need to follow, or understanding that we need to have as a teacher to ensure that children, students, learners, when you are teaching in a class or in a setting which is like a classroom-based setting, they feel safe while learning in the environment. They do not have any risks risks because of health and safety reasons. The classroom is safe. It does not have damp, for example, or paint coming off, or for example, the structure of the room or the equipment that is being used, it path tested, for example, does not provide any areas in terms of how or it could basically harm the learners, which would mean that if say for example they were asked to use a projector and the projector was not working or cranky or can give them electrical shock, then this is a serious health and safety hazard, which would do a couple of things. One is obviously it will create a accident, but the second thing, as an example, as a very brief example, would be that it will create something as an impression in the mind of the learners that they'll feel prohibitive or they'll not feel comfortable using that equipment again ever in their life, because their first experience in terms of usage of that equipment has not been has been bad or has not been useful. And that is where the anticipation in terms of anxiety, nervousness, or stress would built in. And that is why it is important to look at minimizing any sort of risks which would put the teaching and learning side of things for learners at risk in the classroom. The third one that we're going to look at is how to manage confidentiality in relation to information exchange. Now, one of the things that we need to understand very briefly here with the assessment criteria would be to understand how do we keep the information of one learner private from other learners. There are bits that you can share in the class, things like results or good practices or things which are to be shared amongst other learners. But there are going to be lots of things in terms of personal attributes, experience, background, culture related things, or things in terms of areas of, say, for example, I wouldn't. They could be different areas, but when I say areas, areas would mean areas in terms of difficulty, disability. Sometimes these things have to be kept confidential, and the reason why they have to be kept confidential is because some learners might not feel comfortable from an aspect of having their personal information or data being shared with other learners. So that is something which the teachers or instructors have to be very careful about, and that is what we will look at in terms of how would we maintain confidentiality. The last assessment criteria will talk about how to look at maintaining records in accordance with legislatory and organizational procedures. Now, with the implementation of Data Protection Act in 1998 and a revision with GDPR in its guidelines in 2016, there are now, records with schools, educational institutions have to maintain for a period of 3 years, 5 years, 6 years, depending on requirements, legislatory requirements, or procedures or policies and procedures within the organization. Like in the case of UK Versity, most awarding bodies that we work with ask us to maintain records for assessment, verification, certification for a period of 3 years, 4 years. Now, if you are to maintain personal data and records for a period of for such a long period, just as an example, when you look at telephone records, as per the regulatory authority of telecom, phone calls have to be recorded and kept in place by providers or operators for a period of 6 years. Now, that's a long time. And if you look at educational setup and you look at the kind of records which get created, they have to be stored, they have to be archived, and then the restriction to the access of these records have to be maintained through a proper process and a channel. And in such cases, you would look at that one, the records are being maintained, whether it's in paper form or electronic form, and then what kind of requirements, legislatory and organizational, that we need to follow to ensure that these records are kept safe. These records have what are called access rights, and these access rights are maintained and defined within the policies and procedures to ensure that only people with access to them or requirements to be able to access them can access them, and others do not have access to it unless permissions or approvals are sought. So those are the bits that we're going to look at in terms of the learning outcome 3 and its assessment criteria. So in order to discuss this, what I'm going to do is obviously look at a presentation that I've created, a few slides that we are going to go through that will allow us to go into detailing of what is required to be studied in this particular assessment criteria and the learning outcome. So let's get into this. The first thing that we want to look at is in terms of the indicative content, there are divided into three parts. One is responsibilities. Second is to look at basically understanding the confidentiality part of it, and the third part looking at storage and health and safety confidentiality, and the third part basically looking at storage of records, and obviously looking at maintaining that from a point of view of regulatory and organizational requirements. Now, there is one particular video which I would suggest that you need to look at. This video basically talks about group learning strategies and tips, and this is a video which I will show you very briefly, which I would suggest that you need to watch. And once you do so, it will give you a bit of a good overview of this particular learning outcome, which basically focuses on managing learning in groups and how it complies with, I would say, how it complies with the legislatory and regulatory requirements from a point of view of, maintaining records and keeping the records safe. So this is a short video of about 3 minutes, which I would suggest that you could look at watching offline after this session, and it will give you a very good understanding, as I mentioned, in terms of an overview of how do you look at promoting teaching and learning in groups within the class. So this particular video is basically recorded by a teacher, and he, in this particular video, establishes and obviously gives you certain brass tacks that you need to establish in the class to be able to then let's say, promote learning in groups within the classroom. So do watch this video as a bit of a let's say a bit of a homework after the session, and that should give you a good overview of this particular learning outcome. Now, let's focus on the um, key terminology, and the main part of today's learning outcome is to focus on managed learning in groups. That's the keyword that we want to be looking at. And when we do talk about this particular keyword or key terminology in terms of how does learning happen in group, there could be a lot of ways through which you look at learning happening in groups. And learning happening in groups is done primarily to help students, children, learners develop critical process skills, thinking skills, and allows them to develop their skills in general to be able to pick up the content and I would say pick up the knowledge related to the content which is being taught or delivered in the class. Now there are lots of strategies that you can look at primarily and in terms of managing learning in groups. Now there are two widely accepted principles that or strategies that we look at. One is the learners construct their own knowledge and learning in a inherently social phenomenon. So when we do talk about learners essentially developing knowledge and skills by their own learning, that would be something when we look at the concept of constructivism, which is primarily a learning theory that states that in terms of when learners are put together in groups, learners actively construct their own understanding of the world rather than passively receiving information. So here the onus is on the learners, and the learners are able to build knowledge bases, their prior knowledge. They are able to enhance that existing knowledge on the basis of their prior knowledge. That means they are able to build on to things that they already know and related to new information that they are getting from teachers or learners or instructors in the class, and they are able to build them on as newer experiences. Then we also look at social interaction, which is an important part in the learner's construct, which is the constructivism theory. So in this case, the social part in terms interaction, social interaction, which learners are able to do when they are put in groups, allows them to learn, share, compare, and reformulate ideas. And that is something which is widely accepted as one of the key constructs through which you would generally see that learners are able to, actively develop their own understanding and knowledge of things around when they are put together in groups. Now, the other ways that we can look at is when in small groups, learners are given opportunities to articulate ideas and understanding, and that would look at, basis certain assumptions. They would look at doing a lot of discussions. They would, get into the habit of, I would say, or get into the flow of, having discussions, and these discussions sometimes may lead to results or unanimously agree to certain results, and in some cases this will lead to disagreements. So in this case, when we look at learners working together in smaller groups, you would generally see that this leads to the development of deeper learning, and also helps them in improving their thinking skills, which is basically thinking and creative skills. Now, these are the two ways in which the learners would essentially learn. And I would say sometimes when you look at mature learners or students in high school or in higher education, you would generally see that they would build on their experience that they have gained in the world. They will reflect on those experiences, and using that reflection that they do, they are able to then represent and incorporate new information, which would be adding more knowledge to the existing information that they have from their previous experiences. Now, one of the things that we have incorporated and we have looked at in terms of definition, previously as well, is the concept of group learning. And that is something which is being repeated in this learning outcome, because it says when we did this concept of group learning, we looked at it in the learning outcome too, when we talked about how to manage group learning environments. Now here, or we looked at what is group learning environments in the learning outcome 2, and in the learning outcome 3 we are looking at how do we manage group learning environments. So it's not about learning what is group learning, it is about how do we manage group learning and group learning environments. So when we talk about group learning, refers to collection of people or children in this case who would be emotionally, intellectually, and aesthetically engaged in solving problems or creating something, and they would have the same target or goal as a group to be able to achieve at the end of the activity or at the end of the process of learning that they get into. So, group learning is very important in teaching because it's a methodology where students work together in small groups to learn and solve problems. And this is what you get to see, which leads to the development of critical thinking skills, analytical skills, and in general problem solving skills when we look at children in nursery, primary, and nursery essentially, or nursery and primary school essentially, wherein there is a lot of emphasis and focus put on group learning. Group learning could also be termed as what is called cooperative learning or peer learning or team learning. Now, group learning can take place in many kind of settings. It can include settings like classroom. This can also happen in workplaces. It can happen outside the classroom. And if you recall some of the examples that I've given classroom wise, you could look at lots of different activities which teachers would be carrying out and doing in terms of, I would say, classroom based could be an activity that the teacher has given to the students, put them into a group and say, can you make a presentation on this particular topic? That could be classroom based setting. In workplaces, when you look at practical or apprenticeships, or when you look at practical trainings which are done in say workplaces, they would be looking at people shadowing other colleagues to learn certain skills. And in some cases, if I give you an example, when you look at practical skills like carpentry, plumbing, electrician, or in general joinery, masonry, what you would generally see in those cases is that the instructor would put the learners into group and would be given practical tasks to say erect a wall, to look at plumbing this particular part, or working on this particular part of the exercise, and that would be something which the learners would do from a practical experience point of view by working together in small groups. Then you could also look at group learning, which could happen in outside classroom kind of spaces. And one of the examples that I'd given you was in the previous session was that if you were a couple of people put together into a group and you were going river rafting, so in that case the instructor on the boat would essentially be the guide. He or she would be calling the shots, but he or she would expect you to do the things together as a group in order to go through that particular process of river rafting, so that there are no injuries and no incidents. And in such cases, you would see that as teamwork, or as people who are working together in teams, as in small groups, would be carrying out that adventure sport activity of river rafting, and that would be something termed as an activity, or a zip line that you do when sometimes children go across to activities like they go to zoos, or activities like parks, or fun or adventurous game activities from schools time to time, like camping. They would be looking at learning which is happening in groups in terms of outside the classroom. So, for example, life skills that they will learn when they are going out camping, how to build a fire, or for example, how to remain safe during the night, or how to look at doing certain activities when you have to venture out in the night. So people going in groups and things like that, and they would be classroom based, outside classroom based activities which could happen and depict what is called group learning. Now, the most important part that we have to look at is what is the importance of group learning when we look at classroom based environment. Now, here the process of obviously organizing and conducting the business of the classroom would be something which the teacher would manage. And in this case, the teacher would lay down certain ground rules in terms of how the classroom needs to be, what is the decorum of the classroom, what kind of things can be done in the classroom, said in the classroom, how do you ask questions. And the idea in general would be to ensure that the settings in the classroom are safe. That means the environment is safe. It is warm enough. For example, winters are now here. So if children are going to school, teachers need to ensure that the classroom are warm enough. There is heating working within the classroom so that children feel comfortable when the classes are being conducted. And that is an example of giving them a safe environment there, where they feel that they are not feeling the cold, or for example, the equipment within the class is functional, and that allows them to be more tuned towards the facet of learning. Now, the other bits that you have to do apart from physical infrastructure side, you also have to look at ensuring that the classroom is inclusive. The practices that you take into hand are inclusive. That means you give equal opportunities to everybody in the class to participate in activities and to answer queries or ask questions. And in such cases, what will happen is generally you would see that the teaching and learning would be motivational. Learners would be more engaging, learners would be more interactive, and that would be conducive for conducting a good class, or a good session with the students or with the children involved in the class. Now, one of the things that we looked at in learning outcome 2 was the self-discipline approach, and this is something which teachers would essentially advocate to students, that when they are in a class, they need to follow certain rules and regulation. They need to depict a particular kind of behavior, and that behavior needs to conform with the school policies or college policies, and that would be the disciplinary approach which would be taken into account from a point of view of ensuring that the classroom can be managed in a much, let's say, conducive way. It should be something which is, students enjoy by studying in the class, and they enjoy coming to the class, and there is a rapport or a good relationship which exists between the teacher and the students. One of the things that we looked at in the last presentation and the discussion was the instructional approach and the desist approach. Now these were the four things, I would say the three things in particular when we talk about classroom management that we discussed, because it was related to group learning and group learning environments in learning outcome 2. And what we are going to get into in this presentation and the learning outcome is how to manage that. But again, these three aspects of how to create a good management of the class are consistent with this particular learning outcome as well, that we need to look at the disciplinary approach, which is primarily the implementation of policies and procedures and certain ground rules that the teacher lays down for managing the classroom in a more effective way. The instructional approach, wherein the teacher essentially looks at using, I would say, activities which are going to be giving instructions to the students, children, to be able to follow those instructions easily to carry out those tasks and activities. And the third was the desist approach, wherein the approach primarily focuses on the teacher having the full responsibility to be able to regulate and manage the classroom. So here the teacher looks at reinforcing the rules, which are specific rules to control the attitude, behavior, and how students behave in the class. Now, this is generally something that you have to look at primarily, in sometimes in the primary school, and sometimes when you look at dealing with mature learners, maybe in the secondary school, or with adult learners, wherein some of these approaches are non-flexible and students, and for example, the policies are very clear, so misbehavior isn't tolerated. Sometimes we get to hear this, that when you call up banking, if you do telephone banking and you call up, then sometimes the voice message would say that please be polite to our staff, and at no point in time any misbehavior will be tolerated, and the staff has the ability to be able to end the call. So in such cases, misbehavior or appropriate in behavior would not be tolerated, and in such cases the DCS approach would essentially view this from a point of view of maintaining a strict decorum in the classroom with set of specific rules which every student has to follow in order to uh, you know contribute meaningfully in the classroom. Is that okay? So that's the bit of the overview that we wanted to discuss in terms of how do we look at managing learning in groups, specifically with the requirements of complying with requirements of managing the classroom. Any questions on this? So let's look at some of the assessment criteria now. So 3.1 talks about how do we support learners in relation to equality and diversity. Now, one of the things that we need to look at when we talk about supporting learners in terms of equality and diversity is that we need to look at certain, theoretical frameworks. So when we talk about the social model of disability, in some cases, which is a theoretical framework. Now, we need to be looking at promoting equality and no, let's say, favoritism amongst our students in the class. So when we talk about the social model of disability, it basically is a theoretical framework which views disability as a result of societal barriers. That means there are disabilities which are mental barriers or social barriers that can be constructed by the society, and that could impede the learning of that could impede essentially learning in the classroom. So in such cases, when we look at these societal barriers which are created rather than people having physical or mental disabilities, then in such cases what the teacher's role is to primarily ensure that these barriers are removed, these hurdles are removed, these hurdles and barriers do not restrict people from making the right choices. And these barriers can come across in the physical environment. It could be through attitude or behavior, it could be communication in general, and in some cases inflexible organizational practices and policies could also create some of these barriers which could impede the process of teaching and learning in the classroom. So in such cases, our role is primarily to ensure that these barriers are dismantled. There are no such barriers which restrict or impede the teaching and learning of teaching and learning in a classroom based environment. And in order to do so, we have to look at the various other facets of how these barriers can be created. So which are physical environment, attitude and behavior, communicational problems, or procedures and practices which are inflexible. So in order to explain that how do we support learners rights in relation to equality, diversity, and inclusion, we need to be looking at taking into account some of these legislatory and acts, which are legislation and act in general, which have been developed into policies in relevant educational institutes. So, for example, in our case, we have an equality and diversity policy, which is based on the Equality Acts of 2010. Now, under this, we need to ensure that all equal opportunities are provided to all learners who are studying a particular course or studying a particular program with us. We need to ensure that obviously the development of how the course is taught and the program is delivered is inclusive in terms of respecting diverse perspectives, the cultural backgrounds, and obviously in some cases even diversity in terms of course material. Now if we have learners which have, say for example, visual disabilities, then in such cases we do provide material in printed format. Somebody who's dyslexic, for example, then we need to provide support or additional support in the format which is going to be useful for that learner to study that course with us. So there are various ways through which you can ensure that inclusivity and let's say equality is practiced when you are essentially teaching and delivering the program or courses in a classroom based setting. Reasonable adjustments can be made. You could make the environment a bit more accessible. So in some cases, sometimes you would see that in classrooms or in computer labs, you'll have what are called the screens which are put in front of PCs because they can adversely affect people which have certain eye disability, or for example, if they wear glasses, then in such cases, these things in terms of additional equipment would be provided to make it more user friendly. You look at some of the places wherein wheelchair access is provided, and again, this is done primarily to make sure that the environment or the classroom setting is much more accessible. The lifts which are provided in public buildings or in public places would be basically making the learning environment a bit more accessible. Now, there are, in terms of number of other ways through which you can actually look at how we bring equality and diversity and inclusion within the classroom. Now, one of the ways through which this can be done by teachers is by taking into account feedback at the end of every session. Training and awareness, which is done primarily for staff, and these are normally called inset days, which are carried out in school. You would have these additional training and development days or career professional development days in higher educations or other places wherein the staff would undergo training. And just as an example, when we look at training of staff specifically in the case of UK Versity, all the teachers, for example, when they start teaching, they would undergo certain form of trainings, and these form of trainings essentially would involve trainings which are related to, I would say, equality and diversity. It would include training on, there would be a training or, essentially a criminal record check, which is done on them, that they are suitable to be able to teach children or, people over the age of 18. They have no criminal record. You would also see people having to do certification on equality and diversity. There would be, training on safeguarding, which is normally done with by most of our lecturers, and that is to ensure that we are making sure that nobody is abused, neglected in certain cases, and if there is abuse or neglect or harm being carried out, then it is something which the lecturers are able to detect, and then essentially let's say inform the relevant authorities. You look at trainings which are related, I would say. So one is, for example, safeguarding. Second is equality and diversity. You would also look at trainings which are related to checking their records, training on modern slavery, excuse me, training on health and safety, looking at GDPR training, which is data protection and how to look at maintaining confidentiality of information, looking at training on bullying and harassment, looking at training on anti-bribery. We are looking at training primarily, which is being done, to ensure that lecturers are able to essentially, pick up any signs of any sort of thing which is not promoting equality and diversity and inclusion in the class, and they would all be a part and parcel of looking at things which they are aware of, and then they implement this in the classroom based setting to support learners rights in relation to equality, diversity and inclusion. Is that okay? Any questions on the first assessment criteria? So moving on to the second one, which talks about describing how to minimize risks in, say risks to security, safety, health and well-being to learners when you are in a classroom-based setting. Now, here there are 2, 3 theoretical frameworks that we can put into context to ensure that we can look at ensuring that learners feel safe, secure while studying in a classroom-based setting. Now, if we look at certain theories, we look at Maslow's theory of hierarchy of needs. Now, one of the theories, the reason why we look at Maslow's theory of hierarchy of needs is that if you look at the way he proposed the theory, it is a pyramid which has 5 needs that need to be fulfilled in order to ensure that learning can be conducive. So we can relate this theory to that for a classroom-based learning. Now, one of the things that you look at in the pyramid, at the bottom of the pyramid, is the physiological needs, which is things like air, water, food, shelter, and clothing, and other bits that you look at. Now, when you look at the second tier, which is the safety needs, what we need to be able to ensure is basically personal security. We need to ensure health and safety, and we need to ensure well-being of learners. So we can relate Maslow's theory of hierarchy of needs as a theoretical framework here to ensure how do we relate it to the security, safety, health, and well-being needs of the learners in a classroom. And in order to do so, I give you an example that the teachers, when they organize the classroom and activities within the classroom and they set it up, they need to look at things like physical infrastructure. Are the chairs comfortable enough to be able to seat the students for 45 minutes to an hour long in the class? Is the classroom adequately ventilated or heated in the winters? All the equipment that is used in the class, whether it's electronic equipment or equipment which is going to be used by students or children in this case to carry out activities, is it safe? Are there any sharp objects, or are there any let's say furniture or other things in the class which have which could be let's say creating any health hazards in terms of injury, reasons for injury, because if, for example, if the desk is damaged or if the chair is not balanced, can it lead to some sort of physical injury to the child? So all these things have to be looked at from a point of view of organizing the classroom when it comes to ensuring health and safety and well-being for children or learners or students in the class. Now, the second theory that we would look at would be the Albert Bandura's social learning theory. Now, this social learning theory actually explains how people can learn new behaviors by observing and imitating others. Now, this theory is used in classroom management in order to minimize risks, primarily when educators can promote group learning. That means if you try and promote learning in groups through activities or activities that are given to be carried out to achieve an end objective, then in such cases, what the teachers need to ensure is once these activities are given, they are quite explained in detail that why is this activity being carried out. The teachers in some cases need to demonstrate first by practically showing how this activity has to be carried out. That is basically like the application of it to be carried out as an example. Then if there are going to be any tools and techniques to be used in that particular activity, components or tools and techniques, as I would call it, would need to be, provided and checked if they are safe in this case for them to be used by learners, students, to be able to use those activities. And last but not the least, when we look at, the social learning theory, what we are looking at is the interaction which happens between the students when they're put together into groups leads to cognitive, behavioral, and positive environmental influences. That means it suggests that people are, or people, when I say is children, students, learners, essentially are able to, develop and learn something out of it by imitating and observing the behavior of other students in that particular group or in that particular classroom. So this particular theory suggested by Albert Bandura is quite widely applied in very many fields of education, in particular in education psychology and sociology, and uh, you know its primary focus is on understanding behavior in the context of things like aggression, academic performance, and social skills development. So when we do talk about security, when we do talk about safety, health and well-being, what we are looking at in this case is the application of these two theories in order to better manage and understand your learners in the classroom so that you are able to um, uh, you know promote the process of group learning in a much more effective and I would say efficient way. Now, some of the practical measures. So that's theoretical from a theoretical point of view. Now, if I say some of the practical measures, how this is taken into account. For example, if we are to do a particular activity which is outside the classroom, just as an example, one of the things which teachers are asked to do is to do a risk assessment, and that risk assessment is carried out even before the students or children are asked to do those activities. For example, if the students are actually going out to play or do a camping activity, just as an example, there would be a risk assessment done by a set of teachers which will travel to that location, look at where the camp is to be set up, is the site suitable enough, are various facilities available within the reach of that particular site, and they would in general go in and see what are the security hazards, what are the health and safety hazards, excuse me, and also look into things what could be the hazards which could possibly risk or present risks in terms of physical safety when children or students are doing that particular activity or carrying out that activity. So for example, if you go for river rafting, generally the instructor and the company which is, say for example, carrying out that activity would carry out certain health and safety checks to see is the water cold, is there any a sort of infection or in sort of pollutant in the water which could create a health hazard for the participants. They would look at inspecting the safety equipment and the gear, which is things like the boat and the raft and other things. Have they been adequately checked? So all those things would have to be done when we carry out risk assessments. Then clear communication would have to be done with the learners, children or student who are participating in that activity. Sometimes you would see we develop cue cards or instructional cards which are handed out, or handouts which are handed out to parents and children in general, to ensure that they understand what the group activity is, why it is being carried out, and what are the things things that they need to do and what are the things they cannot do. So do's and don'ts are very clearly given out in the form of clear communication when we look at those practical measures of ensuring safety, security, and health and safety and well-being. Then you look at other bits like how do we promote health and well-being. So in some cases, if we feel there are learners which require additional support and they are physically or mentally challenged, then in such cases, advice and guidance is given either to look at doing activities which could be more conducive for them or activities which could be done separately for them as a group of learners. And in some cases, there would be advice given and details given to the parents or shared with the legal guardians to say, okay, if this activity they participate in, these could be the risks. Would you be willing to take those risks, or would he or she, as a learner, be happy to take those risks? And the risk factors are clearly explained so that the outcomes are known, and then a calculated decision is taken to ensure whether this activity would be suitable for that particular set of learner or not. So in such cases, you would also look at things like inspecting the training equipment. You look at obviously some sort of continuous evaluation. Given you an example here would be that every year PAT testing is done within the schools when we look at electrical equipment. And the reason why PAT testing is done is to ensure that everything in terms of the electrical sockets, the equipment which is going to be used, is essentially, fit for purpose. So when we look at portable, appliance testing or PAT testing, it's an inspection carried out by a group of professionals who would basically look at the inspection of electrical appliances and equipment to ensure that they are safe for use. And this would be done, the frequency of this being done is normally recommended as per legislation for every 2 years. So those are the bits that you have to keep in mind when we do talk about, essentially, um, you know, ensuring how do we ensure health and safety and obviously, well-being for learners when they are in a classroom based or even outside the classroom based or in some sort of a setting when they are looking at, engaging in activities or engaging in group learning specifically. Any questions on this so far? Right, let's go across to the third assessment criteria, which is explaining about how do we look at managing confidentiality in relation to group information exchange. Now, when we do talk about looking at maintaining confidentiality from a point of view of group information, there are a couple of things that we can look at. Obviously, there are one or two theories. So when we look at the social exchange theory, or in general, when we talk about the information control theory, what we are looking at is the social exchange theory being used from a point of view of workplace, or in this case, the school, or say, for example, an educational setup. Now, this particular theory emphasizes on maintaining a balance between how we look at in some part of the information which is in the open domain and some part of the information which is kept confidential. There are bits and pieces about students that are generally accessible by teachers, form tutors, the head teacher or administration staff, and there is some part of that information which is only accessible to the form tutor or the teachers who are teaching a particular subject to the student. So in such cases, the confidentiality of information needs to be maintained. The reason I would say this is, or one of the examples that I would give in this case would be when we have learners and we look at the cash report, which is normally given out to children in school, you would see knowledge, attitude, skills, and habits. And in such cases, when reports are discussed, they are discussed individually with parents, with the particular student, and areas in terms of their weaknesses and strengths are pointed out and discussed only with the parent and the student. Some of this information is not shared amongst different students. Yes, but when it comes to a classroom based activity, when you look at carrying out a test or an activity and you have to give out ranking or you have to say who did it the best or who did not do it the best, or there is some sort of ranking involved, then in such cases teachers have to be you understanding that this part of the information can be shared amongst the other children in the class, and this would be good for peer pressure. This would be something which would allow for more competition and more competitive spirit to come within the group, and that would better the learning process or better the achievement of goals and objectives. Now, when we talk about the information control theory, what we are looking at in particular is talking about, looking at um, a relationship between how certain things can be made available, or I would say certain parts of the information that essentially, can be made available or processed by a group of individuals which could have access to that information. And in some cases, some part of this could be utilized. This part of the information could be fed into the system, and then system related access could be used used as a control mechanism to control the flow of that information, to different set of people within the group. So, as an example, in this case, what I would suggest is that if you look at in schools, generally a system called Pro Monitor is used to maintain, students' information, or any sort of a student management system which is used within an educational setup. You would see that there are access rights within that particular system. That those access rights within those systems primarily restrict access to certain form of data. For example, if I look at school, or if I look at a college in this case, you generally see that when assignments are given out by teachers, assessors would assess it. But once the grades have come out, the grades are given to the student, and after that, the grades are accessible by the examination officer, because the examination officer will use the system to upload the grades at some stage within the system, wherein they would be finalized and they would be used at a later stage to claim certification. Now, some part of this information is restrictive and is based on what is called the information control theory, because here the technology or the systems can be utilized, particularly in an organizational context, to focus on how they govern the flow of information, so that it ensures that right people have the information, or information reaches the right kind of people at the right time to be able to make decisions. So things like report cards, things like claiming of certification. When you look at examination officers and their role in terms of claiming certification, then in those cases you would look at the information control theory being used to access information and set rights in terms of which people have access to what information at what point in time, so that they're able to make the right decisions. Now, in general, when we look at managing confidentiality within a particular setup or an educational setup, I would say you would be looking at, certain policies being there, which would primarily clearly define what is to be done in certain situations. So one such policy that you would generally see, which is available in most educational institutions, would be data protection policy. Now, in such cases, what that data protection policy would do is establish very clear guidelines in terms of what information is confidential, what information is public. It would have a very clear documentation in terms of how this information is to be stored, and who has access, and how this information can be retrieved. And if people need access to this information, who would be having the access or the rights to be able to give access to that information. Now, if this information is stored electronically, which is done in now increasingly number of cases, then the information has to be very properly encrypted. It has to have controls in place wherein the information can go and be accessed through secure channels. That means if you have a server, then obviously the room in which the servers store that electronic information is under a lock and key, and that is available with the data administrator or the IT manager within the school. In some cases, if the server is on the cloud, then obviously appropriate systems are put in place, wherein like you have secure SSL encryption, you have access rights to the server, and administrator rights to it, so that not all people or only relevant people have access to that information, and that can be controlled through IT-based system. So when we look at managing confidentiality, essentially what we are looking at is limiting the access to the information, limiting the access to users by restricting the access, by ensuring that they have rights, and only relevant people have access to that information. So when you look at admission data, things like passport, personal data of these students when they are inducted into a school, college, or a course, they would generally be available with the admissions team. But once that data has been used to enroll the student into a course or enroll the child into a school, then after that, that part of the information or the information file which is created as an admission file having the name, date of birth, passport, address, and parents and other details is normally kept securely away in a filing cabinet, and only the head teacher or, for example, the form tutor would have access to those information. And in such cases, you restrict access so that the information cannot be leaked, the information does not fall into the wrong hands. And from time to time, there are trainings and awareness programs carried out within schools, within educational institutions to ensure how this data can be kept securely, using various measures, and thereby ensuring that this data cannot be misused for any by any particular person or organization in the context of teaching and learning. And I've given an example here in terms of how this data can be managed, within an educational setup for further detailing. Any questions on this? Okay,
Yes, sir, clear.
Sorry, go on. Yes, Mohammed, any questions?
No, sir, clear.
Okay. We look at the last assessment criteria, which is talking about how do we maintain records in accordance with legislatory and organizational procedures. Now, there are three things or three acts that we need to be aware of specifically when we talk about this particular assessment criteria. Now, one of the things that we look at is the Freedom of Information Act of 2000, which is something that if users want to get access to a bit of information specifically from public records or the governmental records. Now in some cases when you look at schools, there are pieces of information which the agencies can ask for from the school, and they would normally ask for that part of the information under the Freedom of Information Act. Now when we talk about the Freedom of Information Act, which is also sometimes referred to as FOIA in short form, is a law that UK government created back in 2000, and this allows the public to get access to information which is held by public authorities. So schools are managed by public authorities or council. Colleges and universities are also under the jurisdiction of Ofsted or Ofcall, or in some cases, quality assurance agency. And if certain parts of the information which is confidential, if it has to be requested for the purposes of, I would say, public records or for public information, then that can be requested for under the FOIA Act, which is FOIA or Freedom of Information Act. Now, this act aims to promote transparency and accountability by government and government departments or semi-government organizations, thereby allowing individuals to actually request that information under this particular act. Because public has the right to know, and in some cases, how the school is being managed, how the school's expenses are being managed, or say, for example, what is the salary structure for the staff within a particular school. This can be requested by a parent or any member of the public by asking the school or a particular, in this case, a relevant authority by using the Freedom of Information Act. The second act that we look at, which is where which is legislatory, and we would generally see these two acts being used to create or look at used to creating policies within an organization, and those policies either would be a freedom of information policy or data protection policy within an educational setup, would essentially ensure that information can be accessed, or when information is said to be private, but it is required for public usage or for general data collection, then in such cases you can use these acts or legislatory procedures to be able to ask for information. Now, the Data Protection Act, which was initially introduced in 1998 and then revised in 2018 for under the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, again allows the individuals to have rights regarding the ownership of their personal data. So under the GDPR and the Data Protection Act, most organizations, educational institutions, colleges, universities need to have what is called a DPO or a data protection officer. And if you want your information to be removed, from their records, or if you want access to understand what information they hold about you, then they could actually ask for that information using the Data Protection Act. and they can write to the DPO, and that DPO would be liable to provide information in terms of what personal data or records does the organization hold on their side. And in such cases, anything which is related to personal information, related to, for example, individual rights, and related to, I would say, I would generally say, for example, data which the organization holds for the individual can be requested or can be requested to be removed under this particular act. Now, there are obviously the main aim of understanding that how these records are maintained in accordance with legislatory and organizational procedures. All educational setups need to have a data protection policy. All these setups need to have what is called a freedom of information policy and public audit policy. And there are other policies like whistleblowing, looking at bribery, anti-bribery practices. These policies need to be in place to ensure that information that is held is, held in accordance with legislatory requirements, which is basically the acts which governments have created. Now, in order to safely store this information, again, there are different modes through which this can be stored. Generally, data on the website, when it is collected, it needs to be archived, it needs to be mined, and it needs to be stored securely so that personal information of any particular participant, children, parent, any relevant authority is not provided or leaked away to people who would not want to have access to it or are not, I would say, not authorized to access that information. And in such cases, there would be systems deployed, there would be policies which will be used, and there will be acts. Why we say acts? Because the government legislation, which is the parliament, has created an act that the setup, if you are in this, business side of the business, or if you're in the education business, then you need to have these policies and practices in place in order to maintain, organize, and safely store records which should not be personal records which should not fall into the wrong hands. One of the other things that you will also note that most organizational institutions need to have is the membership to the Information Commissioner's Office, which is called ICO. And this is required because if you are an organization which uses, collects, first and foremost, collects and then uses this personal information which is collected either from websites or other forms of records, for example, newsletters or surveys or feedback mechanisms that you have in place, then in such cases, you should have a membership of the Information Commissioner's Office. That means you're authorized to essentially, authorized to collect, store, and then use this information for various purposes. In some cases, when you look at websites today, they will ask you to accept a cookie, and when you look at accepting that cookie, it'll say only essential cookies, it'll say technological cookies, then it'll say marketing cookies, and you have the option to switch some of these off because you do not want your information to be shared with third parties. And in such cases, the maintenance of records and data in accordance with regulatory procedures or acts has to be done, and that is also very important from a school setup point of view or an educational setup point of view. And in order to do so, when you look at maintaining the records, you look at following policies which are created within the organization on the basis of these acts. And these policies, when implemented, would allow you to manage, maintain, and store records effectively to ensure that there is no data breach and the data does not fall into the wrong hands. So that brings us to the end of this particular learning outcome. Any questions on this so far?
No, sir. Clear.
Okay, that's great. So I will basically request most of you joining the session today is to look at watching this particular video and go through the presentation. And tomorrow we'll meet up at the same time to basically cover, the learning outcome 4 in order to bring this unit to a close. So until then, thanks for joining, and I'll see you tomorrow.